Pooja Verma, a 37-year-old teacher, lived alone in a modest apartment in the bustling city of Hyderabad, India. Her life was simple, filled with routine and the comforting hum of the city around her. Although she enjoyed her solitude, the nights in her apartment could sometimes feel a bit too quiet, a stark contrast to the lively streets outside. One evening in early November, Pooja returned home from work, exhausted from a long day. She planned to unwind with a good book and a cup of chai before heading to bed. The sky was already darkening as she locked the door behind her, shutting out the noise of the city. The apartment felt particularly still, almost oppressively silent. After making herself a cup of chai, Pooja settled into her favorite chair by the window. She loved this spot, where she could gaze out at the distant lights of the city while losing herself in a book. Tonight, however, she found it difficult to focus. A strange sense of unease settled over her, creeping up her spine and making her glance around the room nervously. She tried to shake it off, blaming it on tiredness. But just as she was starting to relax, there was a sudden loud knock at the door. Pooja jumped, her heart skipping a beat. The knock was sharp, almost urgent, echoing through the quiet apartment. She glanced at the clock. It was close to 10 p.m. Who would be visiting at this hour? Cautiously, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. Confused, she waited a moment, expecting to see someone appear, but no one did. She hesitated before slowly unlocking the door and opening it a crack, just wide enough to peek outside. There was no one there. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit hallway looking for any sign of movement, but all she saw was the long stretch of empty corridor. A shiver ran down her spine as she quickly shut the door and locked it again, this time sliding the chain into place as well. Returning to her chair, Pooja tried to calm herself. It was probably just someone knocking on the wrong door, she reasoned. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had barely settled back into her chair when the knocking came again, this time louder and more insistent. The sound reverberated through the walls, filling the apartment with a sense of dread. Pooja's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the door. Her thoughts raced. Was someone playing a prank? Or was there something more sinister at play? She didn't move, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But the knocking continued, relentless and unnerving. Summoning her courage, Pooja approached the door once more. Her hands trembled as she looked through the peephole. Again, there was no one there. Pooja's breath quickened as she backed away from the door, her mind racing with fear. The hallway had been completely empty, yet the knocking had been so clear, so close. She grabbed her phone, intending to call a neighbor or the police, but her hands were shaking so much she almost dropped it. As she fumbled with the phone, there was another sound. This time, it was the doorknob rattling, as if someone were trying to open the door. Pooja gasped, her blood running cold. The door was locked, but whoever or whatever was on the other side was trying to get in. She stood there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the sound of the doorknob being jiggled violently. It stopped suddenly, leaving the apartment in an eerie silence once more. But then, something even more terrifying happened. She heard a faint whisper coming from just outside the door. Pooja. The voice was soft, almost a breath, but it sent chills down her spine. Whoever it was knew her name. Pooja's instinct was to run, to get as far away from the door as possible. She retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her and pressing her back against it as if that would somehow keep her safe. Her mind was in turmoil. How did they know her name? Why were they targeting her? The knocking started again, this time on her bedroom door. She screamed, her voice echoing through the apartment, but no one was there to hear her. Her apartment was on the top floor, and the neighbors on either side were away for the weekend. She was completely alone. Pooja. The whisper came again, closer now, as if the person, or thing, was right outside the bedroom door. She grabbed the heavy metal lamp from her bedside table, holding it tightly in her trembling hands. She knew it wasn't much, but it was the only weapon she had. The knocking continued, relentless, shaking the door in its frame. She could feel her sanity slipping as the terror overwhelmed her. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, filled with an unbearable tension. Pooja held her breath, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of her own heart. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and still there was nothing, just an eerie, oppressive silence. Then, from the other side of the door, she heard it, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like heavy footsteps or something being pulled along the ground. The sound moved away from the door, down the hallway, and then stopped altogether. Pooja stayed frozen in place, too terrified to move. She wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been haunting her had finally left, but she couldn't be sure. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside made her jump. She didn't know how long she stayed there, pressed against the door, gripping the lamp like a lifeline. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her fear, and she drifted into a restless sleep, the lamp still clutched in her hands. When she woke up the next morning, the first thing she noticed was the sunlight streaming through the window. The apartment was quiet, the fear of the previous night seeming almost distant in the light of day. But as Pooja slowly got to her feet, every muscle aching from the tension, she noticed something that made her blood run cold once more. The front door was wide open. Pooja's heart raced as she cautiously approached the door. She was certain she had locked it, not just with the key but with the chain as well. But there it was, standing ajar, as if someone had simply walked in or out during the night. She looked around the apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there. And yet, the door was open, and she had heard the knocking, the whispering, the dragging sound. Pooja quickly shut the door, bolting it securely before she called the building security. They came up to check the apartment, but like before, they found nothing unusual. The security footage showed no one entering or leaving her apartment during the night, but Pooja knew what she had experienced. She could still hear the voice, whispering her name in the darkness, and she could still feel the terror that had gripped her as she cowered in her bedroom. She couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. Within days, she moved out, finding a new place in a different part of the city. But even in her new home, the memory of that night haunted her. Every knock at the door, every creak in the night sent her heart racing, reminding her of the unseen visitor who had come for her. Pooja never found out who or what had been in her apartment that night. But she knew one thing for certain. Something had knocked on her door, something that knew her name, and something that she would never forget.